Ah, Sumeru. Yes, it was such a great idea to start with this nation after having taken a break from the History of Teyvat series because it's not like Sumeru is super complicated, everyone. Oh no, no. It's not like I have multiple civilizations to keep track of that are all going on at the same time with similar people with gods doing stupid dipshit things that I'm gonna have to keep track of. No, no, there's nothing like that. And, it's not like knowing my luck that Hoyo will put out something tomorrow that completely invalidates everything I'm going to say here. No, that's definitely never happened before at all. I'm always so on top of it when it comes to this stuff. So here we are, the complete, as of today, history of Sumeru. We have a lot to cover, so let's just get right into it. So basically, the old world was the world before the heavenly principles showed up. The one that, was ruled by the dragons. In the area that would become Sumeru, Apep the Dendro dragon ruled over the land. The land was verdant and lush, and it seemed as if Apep had more of a role akin to a god of nature or life, as Apep mentions that while she knows of Irminsul because it was born into the world during her era, in fact it was quote-unquote the first fern to sprout from her court. It did not have the ability to record data or bind the fate of the world, and it seems as if Apep mostly just kinda let Irminsul be. Or if it did have some sort of bigger purpose, Apep didn't reveal it to us as of yet. We do know that Irminsul is intricately tied to Teyvat, and was tied to Teyvat before the Heavenly Principles showed up. It's possible that Irminsul had something to do with the dragons and Vishops coming from the Light Realm, or had some greater connection to the Light Realm in general, but that's speculation on my part. Anyways, back to the point. Nibelung, king of the dragons. He meets with a Voyager, who tells him fuck shit is heading his way, and he goes, LMAO, whatever babe, and decides to pull a Gilgamesh and go searching for knowledge or some other such nonsense, leaving the Dragon Sovereigns in Teyvat, and creating the Three Moon Sisters to watch over the world while he's gone. This goes about as well as one would expect, because eventually the Heavenly Principles show up. And let me tell you, they showed up and pretty much immediately started yoinking elemental authority and in general causing problems. But because Nibelung isn't there, it would seem that the Dragon Sovereigns don't have much recourse, because apparently they're little bitches. It's during this time that the Heavenly Principles fuck around with Irminsul, making it anchor the world's fate and also record any and all data going on into that. The Heavenly Principles creates the Shades and the people and the angels, and so begins the First Era, which goes pretty well for people up until Nibelung comes back from getting the milk and decides to fight the Heavenly Principles. Now, you'd think that a 7v1 fight with the dragons versus the principles, or I guess it'd really be an 8v1 fight, huh? Anyways, you'd think that that would be heavily in favor of the dragons. No, you'd be wrong. They get fucking brothel stomped. So he and the dragons are defeated, some die, some fuck off, and others remain trapped in the land they once ruled with no real power to speak of. It's during the First Era that the civilizations of Sumeru, or I should say the human civilizations of Sumeru, are created and united. Rukkhadevata is also born sometime during this time as the avatar of Irminsul, though I'm pretty sure this is probably after the War of Funerary Flame, because it makes more sense to me that it would be after the War of Funerary Flame. Either way, after the war is over, celestial nails are driven into the land of Sumeru, turning it into a giant fuck-off desert. This is likely done to further limit Apep's power. And I will also say, at some point during this period, the angels are all cast down from Celestia because of reasons that they still haven't exactly talked about. I guess the angels fell in love with people, and I don't know, Celestia felt like that was incest or something, so they all get turned into Seelies except two very important examples that we know of right now. Now, after that, there was supposedly an era of peace that was established. And this era of peace is where the timeline gets a bit fuzzy. We know that the angels likely fell around the time of the War of Funerary Flame, as previously mentioned, because the Moon Sisters are also locked away by Nibelung around this time, and the false sky was created by the Heavenly Principles. Nabu Malikata was formerly an angel, but somehow survived the downfall of her race and instead became a god of Sumeru in the following eras. It's also in this time period that King Deshret seems to have come into being, although he's noted to be a child of the sky, but doesn't know anything of angels or Celestia, so his origins are also a bit vague. Either way, it seems like he and Nabu Malikata met first, and she gave him a sort of rundown of the history of his land. It also seems very clear that King Deshret had feelings for Nabu Malikata, but it's a bit unclear if she had feelings back. So I'm gonna say that she probably didn't, and that he was friend-zoned hard. Nabu Malikata also created the Jinn around this time, one of whom was Lilupar, who will come back into the story later on, Apep, the Dendro Dragon, is also going to come back into the story later on, so just kind of put a pin in both of their names. Now, here is where things get a bit tricky. It would seem that the gods of Sumeru did not have a lot of infighting amongst themselves, which makes the end of the interim period and the start of the Archon War in Sumeru a bit hard to define. For the most part, it seems as if King Deshret had ambitions to quote-unquote conquer the world, and indeed he would end up conquering much of Sumeru. Many of the smaller gods would even join into his service or leave Sumeru altogether. One of the gods who chose to leave Sumeru was actually Remus, who would become famous for creating a civilization in Fontaine because he couldn't hack it in Sumeru. It's during this time that Nabu Malikata and King Deshret also mate Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, and the three would become friends. Sources vary a bit here too. Some say that it was Nabu Malikata and King Deshret that created the city of that name. I'm sorry everyone, there are going to be a lot of words that I can't try to pronounce because just watch my other videos if you want to see why it's really hard for me to pronounce words, and I'm not going to do the disrespect of absolutely rib-caging it on all of these words, so if I can't pronounce something, it will be up on screen. There you go. Others, however, say that all three gods created the city that's on screen right now. However, regardless of who built the city, all three gods did eventually rule it as the three eternal god kings, and they ruled in harmony with one another. It's also stated that King Deshret had affection for Greater Lord Rukkhadevata, but the vibe I get from this relationship is much more of a brother-sister sort of vibe, or like really close friends. Regardless, this city was known as a city for the Jinn, though it's likely that humans lived within the city too, and times were good. But as with all good things in Teyvat, they don't last, and unfortunately, Nabu Malikata got a vision of the cataclysm that's to happen way in the far future, and this sets off a series of events that would put us more squarely within the Archon War timeframe. Due to her vision, Nabu Malikata creates the Kavarena, something like that, and gives it to Rukkhadevata, telling her it will become important for her to use in the future. That's not vague at all. Rukkhadevata turns the Kavarena into a bird that will protect the people in the future and then puts the big bird friend to sleep. Sometime before things start getting really messed up, King Deshret is offered a gift from Celestia, which is thought to have been a Gnosis, but King Deshret basically told them to fuck right off, which I'm sure Celestia was totally chill about. Something important to note here is that we don't know exactly why King Deshret told them to fuck right off, other than it stated that he wanted to focus on his own interests and ambitions, and he also really kind of hated Celestia in general. I think that this stems more likely from a kind of selfish personal desire to basically not be bound by the fate that Celestia created, because overall the vibe I get from King Deshret is that he's kind of an arrogant, egotistical, selfish bastard. I'm not saying that he doesn't have his good points. You can be an egotistical, arrogant, selfish bastard and still have your good points, but I think that's probably why he told Celestia to fuck right off. Anyways, after telling Celestia to fuck right off, he shares with Nabu Malikata that he wished to overthrow Celestia, because that went so well last time. Nabu Malikata reminds him of what happened to her people when they went against Celestia, and King Deshret basically tells her that she worries too much. Even though Nabu Malikata knows that it will end poorly, not just for her, but for Deshret and the rest of the people in Sumeru, she also realized that there was a potential, possible, maybe itty-bitty tiny chance that King Deshret could quote-unquote change the world's fate. And that's why she broke into Celestia and gave King Deshret the higher knowledge and some of their technology, which he would use in the coming eras to create many wonders. However, despite the fact that she thought he might have an itty-bitty tiny little itty-teeny possibility of changing the world's fate, she wanted to remind him that despite this path to higher knowledge, as she would say, it would be humanity that had any real hope of defeating the divine. And perhaps her saying this is why King Deshret would incorporate the use of mortals into the operation of some of his greatest wonders, like Aru. Now, you might also be thinking, well, Kara, if she thought that people were only going to be able to be the ones to defeat the divine, why would she even go to do this with King Deshret, especially if she knew that it was going to end poorly? And to that I tell you, yeah, this fucking bitch is the root cause of so much shit. Her and King Deshret fucking suck. Anyways, moving right along. Greater Lord Rukkhadevata saw what the fuck they were doing and went, hell to the fuck no, I'm not in on this plan, and pieced the fuck out from her homies, going off to create a civilization for her own people. Nabu Malikata understood why she left, because again, as previously mentioned, she understood that what she was doing was a stupid fucking decision. And although she hoped to see her friend again in the future, it doesn't seem like that was ever really gonna happen, and she probably knew that. It also doesn't seem as if her parting had any real negative impacts on King Deshret. Instead, it seems like they kind of just agreed to live and let live, at least for a time. We'll talk more about these civilizations later, so for now we're going to focus on the fallout of the decision to steal knowledge from Celestia. The betrayal of Nabu Malikata to Celestia sealed her fate, and she would be killed. However, she desired to go out spectacularly because she thought to herself, I haven't fucked up enough stuff, I must continue to do so. So as to be remembered in the future, she decided that her death would be a willing sacrifice to ensure that King Deshret would have access to the knowledge of the skies and the abyss. Because what could possibly go wrong? The fallout of this death created sandstorms which destroyed the city that all three had built together. King Deshret, however, because communication is apparently a skill that none of the gods in Teyvat have ever learned, was unaware of the fact that she was willingly sacrificing herself and began to spiral into grief and decided that he was going to find a way to bring his dead girlfriend back to life. It's at this point that the city is left abandoned, and the Jinn were just told that their god was just sleeping. She's just sleeping, guys. King Deshret was like, come on, follow me. I'm going to wake her up. It's going to be fine. And in the end, he would, along with the power of the Jinn, create the Eternal Oasis, which was meant to be a memorial for Nabu Malikata. Additionally, King Deshret did his best to gather as many fragments of her power and soul as he could to bring to that place, but ultimately, some of those pieces would remain missing. In the end, the death of Nabu Malikata and the departure of Rukkhadevata, King Deshret ended up ruling over the deserts alone. Now, this is where things get a bit tricky, because sources are a bit conflicting, and more importantly, we have two POVs to follow, Rukkhadevata and King Deshret. We're going to start with King Deshret because he's kind of the reason things go to shit, but just realize that everything I'm going to be talking about here kind of happens at the same time. So, after his dead not-girlfriend died, King Deshret decided to start trying to build a utopia. Because, you know, that always just goes so well. He wanted to build a utopia to be free of worry, schemes, and slavery. Now, good news is, one of those things is totally achievable. The other two? Not so much. But before he decided to go out and build his super sick, cool new kingdom, he decided he needed to go talk to the Dendro Dragon Apep. Told y'all that she'd come back into the story. Now, Apep hates humans and gods, because, you know, they're of Celestia, the colonizers that came in and took all of her power and then relegated her to the desert, where she suffers to this day. But King Deshret needed Apep to chill the fuck out because Apep was creating sandstorms that was fucking everyone's shit up, because Apep thought that would be funny. So he and Apep made a deal. He could build his kingdom in the desert with all of his fancy higher knowledge that he supposedly received, and when his kingdom inevitably collapsed, Apep would get to eat him and his kingdom. King Deshret, firmly believing that he was going to find a way to live forever, agreed to this deal. Now, with the sandstorms kind of mostly chilled the fuck out, he decided to go and start building his kingdom. Now, you might be thinking, Kara, didn't he kind of already sort of build a kingdom? What happened to them? Well, apparently, he and Nabu Malikata must have decided to not pay very much attention to their kingdom because, as previously mentioned, it fell apart, and most of the people scattered around the desert, forming small tribes. Using the Jinn as his envoys, King Deshret brought people back under his banner by promising them eternal paradise and salvation. Eventually. And he only sought humans with hearts that were quote-unquote untainted by the allure of corruption to serve as his vassal kings and priests. He needed this because despite him saying that he was going to build a civilization that would be a utopia unlike anything else, he decided to pawn off most of the actual ruling to his human kings and priests and his godly ministers. He built his royal city named Akatamen, where he resided and continued his research into forbidden knowledge, becoming more and more obsessed with the past where Nabu Malikata was alive and Rukkhadevata never left. Now, during this time, Lulupar. Remember I told you she would come back into the story? Yeah. She found a human named Ormats to overthrow a human tyrant and establish the city of Gurabad. Now, I do want to preface this by telling you guys up front that the story of Gurabad is super duper actually super interesting, and low-key kind of reads like a political epic full of intrigue and betrayal. In fact, it kind of reminds me of an overly sarcastic Productions video that they made like forever ago about a Snake King. Anyways, I'll try to link that video like in the description if I can find it. All of this is to say, But I'm not going to recount the full story here because this video is going to already be a fucking nightmare to edit without me adding extra time, so here's just the TLDR version. Mormots did eventually manage to take over, but he kinda became a corrupt dickhead, and Lilupar took this very personally because she was his wife, and also the one who picked him to rule, and so she was pissed off about this betrayal. I would make the argument that she was just maybe a shitty judge of character, but you know, who am I to judge? Now, she thought to herself, how am I going to ruin this bastard's life? And she decided that she was going to do that by exacting her vengeance through a convoluted plan that would fuck over her husband, her daughter that she had through this husband, and her daughter's son, fucking over 3 generations of humans because one person decided to be an asshole. That feels super fair. In the end, she successfully brought down Gurabad through tricks and manipulation, ruining the lives of many people, and also low-key using the Abyss to twist the knife even further into the humans that she felt betrayed her. Now, eventually, Deshret lifted his head up long enough to notice some shit was going down and found out what Lilupar had done, and as punishment, he had her soul split into 7 pieces and scattered them around the desert, and eventually she would be kind of sealed in a jar. So, you know, that's how things ended with Lilupar at least. Gurabad ended up falling within 3 generations due to Lilupar's meddling, but other city-states mostly functioned about as well as one could expect. Which means they basically functioned by themselves because the governance of the desert was still really fragmented because King Deshret, as previously stated, was obsessed with bringing his dead, not girlfriend back to life and was so obsessed with it that he decided he wasn't actually gonna rule shit. In the end, his obsession would be his undoing. I know that we're all shocked by that. Even though he built great wonders like the primal constructs, Aru, and the supposedly eternal paradise, all of that was really just to fuel his own selfish ends to live in a world where he could be with his dead, not girlfriend. Perhaps on some level he still held some benevolence towards people because within his kingdom, he made sure that humans had to have a hand in the operation and construction of Aru, and even sealed some of his godly ministers inside. One can interpret this as maybe him trying to make sure that the humans would have some kind of power over the gods if he were to eventually leave, or maybe he just did it for funsies, who knows. Eventually, his research into forbidden knowledge had catastrophic consequences that absolutely none of us foresaw happening. The forbidden knowledge infected the land and the people, creating the Withering and Elazar, which would continue to cause people suffering into the future. He called upon Rukkhadevata for help, which I'll go into more in her section. But ultimately, even when she did show up to help, which, I mean, honestly, Homegirl didn't have to do that. Well, okay, I guess I should rephrase. She kinda did have to do it, because if she didn't, it was eventually going to affect her people, but still. He was far too corrupted by forbidden knowledge, which is abyssal corruption. And he knew that if he still stuck around, he was gonna end up just ruining everything even more for everyone else. So he thought to himself, man, what is the most fucked up way I could sort of help, but also make things worse for everyone? I know, I'll go talk to the dragon Apep. So he went to Apep to fulfill their deal and allowed the dragon to eat him. Now, Apep didn't know that he was contaminated by abyssal corruption, so when she ate him, she also became infected and was tormented for thousands of years by this corruption. Deshret likely did do this to prevent the corruption from spreading to his kingdom, but even with this maybe somewhat good intention, this corruption caused the Dendro dragon so much suffering, and ultimately would become a problem for the future Dendro Archon to resolve in the future. Because why fix your own messes when you can just kick the can down the road and make it somebody else's problem, am I right? Now, we're gonna break away from King Deshret's civilization and go over to Rukkhadevata's civilization. So, after separating from King Deshret and Nabu Malikata, Rukkhadevata went to the east and terraformed the desert to create a rainforest. She did this with the Varuna contraption? This word up on screen? Which controlled the rain cycles of the era and erected the Wall of Samael to prevent the forest from succumbing to desertification. Please don't ask me how long it took me to be able to say desertification correctly, because I'll have to kill myself. She also created the Forest Labyrinth to protect the construct and charged the lore of the forest, this guy's name, to protect it. He was born from the moon's reflection on the water and resembles a tiger. Why that's important, I don't know, but apparently it is. With the help of her followers, they would establish the Amrta Darshan of the Academia, and the rainforest flourished, and Sumeru City was built on the Divine Tree, which is connected at least partially to Irminsul. Rukkhadevata allowed the sages of the Academia to assist her in running Sumeru, and the Academia by extension. A plan I am sure will have no negative repercussions in the future at all. I'm also sure that this separation between Rukkhadevata and King Deshret and their people will in no way lead to discrimination into the future, and that would just be totally crazy. I mean, come on guys, what do we think we are? Rukkhadevata also during this time created the Aranara and gave them the ability to control dreams. Why? Who's to say? It seems as if the civilization Rukkhadevata created largely during this time was free of war or suffering, though the beginnings of discrimination against the people of King Deshret, as well as the diverging beliefs of knowledge and wisdom, were well on their way to flourishing. However, eventually Rukkhadevata got word from King Deshret that he had fucked around and was currently finding out, and he was about to make that her problem. Rukkhadevata went into the desert and constructed pillars with the people to try and mitigate the spread of forbidden knowledge as well as purify the area. Ultimately, after seeing Aru, she used that as a basis to create the Akasha system, which was meant to collect Sumeru's wisdom to combat the spread of forbidden knowledge. Doing this exhausted her of her power and turned her into a childlike state. Also, it's important to note that this is probably around the time that people of Sumeru, or at least the people kind of the academia or of Dharma Forest, were somewhat not able to dream anymore. It seems like anyone with access to the Akasha or connected into the Akasha couldn't dream because that's how the Akasha system would harvest their wisdom, was through their dreaming. I don't know why Hoyo decided to write it that way. Please don't ask me of how this works because I genuinely kind of have no idea. Something, however, I do think is interesting to note is that Rukkhadevata did turn into a more childlike state after this, and I should say childlike form, not childlike state, and we know that Kusanali, the future Dendro Archon, is also very childlike in her state, not necessarily in her mind. I think that this is interesting because what it shows me is that there seems to be, like, their power is correlated to, like, their physical age in some way, and it seems like during the Eternal Three God Kings sort of era, Rukkhadevata, Nabu Malikata, and King Deshret all kind of accumulated knowledge themselves and then chose what to disseminate amongst the people, whereas Kusanali, or Nahida, chooses a more decentralized version of wisdom. Nahida, in a lot of ways, is more of a passive ruler, not in terms of, like, she's not there to, like, help, but more in the ways that she wants her people to be able to come to their own answers and work through the problems themselves. She's there for advice, but she's not necessarily going to tell them what the correct answer is. Versus it seems like previously Rukkhadevata ruled in a very different way. She kind of just took actions that she felt were the right ones regardless of whether or not her people agreed with them or not. It's just an interesting kind of way to see that Nahida, despite maybe looking a little bit less powerful or maybe a little bit less majestic, seems to just have a different version of ruling. Again though, that's more of a side thought and really doesn't have any bearing on this video. Focusing back in on the aftermath of King Deshret's death, his remaining priests went and built Aru village as the last bastion of his civilization, and his people scattered and their stories continue after the Archon War. It's important to note that the Akasha system requires the use of the Dendrognosis, and so it's very likely that Rukkhadevata was chosen as the Dendro Archon sometime after her split with King Deshret, although it doesn't seem as if this change in her status meant anything to the God King. Maybe that's because of their previous alliance, or maybe he was just too obsessed with trying to bring his dead, not girlfriend back to life to notice. Who's to say? In any case, post-Archon War Sumeru is actually very similar to the Archon War version of Sumeru, in that there are essentially two civilizations living in, we're gonna call it coexistence, but that might still be a strong word because the academia did not treat the people of the desert very well. In fact, they treated them like absolute trash, and there was kind of this whole elitist sort of situation brewing in the academia in the first place. The academia spread its influence and power in Sumeru, establishing the other darshans or schools and establishing so-called rules that they were meant to live and study by. Supposedly, these rules were meant to keep sages or any within the academia from growing corrupt or seeking out forbidden knowledge, but we all know how that song and dance tends to play out. So in any case, as the academia flourishes, there appears to be a disconnect between the people who live within the rainforest and the desert. Overall, the records of the time depict a time of peace and prosperity for the academia, while the people of the desert get to enjoy roughly 1,500 years of political turmoil and war after King Deshret's death. There is something I want to point out here, because the academia in the present day of Sumeru definitely looks down on the people of the desert and the civilizations they're in. Oftentimes when we encounter story quests or world quests that take us into the desert, we get this sort of vibe from the researchers that they are more interested in the desert's distant past, usually with King Deshret, or the times before his death. In this way, whether intentionally written to be so or not, there's this energy from certain NPCs and characters within the academia that they see the ancient civilizations of King Deshret as impressive, or even as a sort of golden age, whereas now the people of the desert are simply resources to use or mercenaries to hire, because fuck them. To connect this back to the real world for a moment, it actually kind of reminds me a lot of Victorian-era England and their fascination with ancient Egypt specifically. They had no real interest in the lives or culture of the currently living Egyptians, but had this almost cult-like fascination with so-called ancient Egypt. And, you know, that ended up leading to some pretty horrible things that still kind of continue to this day, like the fact that the British Natural History Museum still has tons of shit in its collection that it grave robbed and stole from Egypt. Are they ever going to give it back? No. Anyways, taking this away from the real world and moving it kind of back into the world of Genshin, there is another meta thing I kind of want to point out here. And this is that the civilizations of the desert had to contend with losing their god and basically having no remaining political structure post King Deshret's death. There were no other gods, as those that existed were either dead or locked up in Aru, or in the Dendro Dragon's case, literally insane and also kind of hates people. And it doesn't seem as if Rukkhadevata really did anything to try to incorporate or offer aid to the people of the desert after dealing with the forbidden knowledge that was plaguing them. Now, one can maybe argue that they wouldn't have accepted her help, because in their view she abandoned their god, and they did not hold her to a very positive light, I guess. And one can also maybe argue that she had no real obligation to do so, since she kind of had her own people to run and she wasn't in the best place power-wise at the end of the Archon War. However, the fact remains that the academia got to enjoy over 1,000 years of political stability, and arguably easier land to cultivate and live on, since I would argue having a god constantly terraforming and ensuring your rainforest remains habitable for you is probably easier than living in the fucking desert where you have no such help. It makes sense then why the people of the desert would end up in a worse situation than the people of the academia, who would end up having more prosperity in the intervening years. I know that this was kind of a tangent, but I wanted to touch on this political and sociological stuff before moving on, because it really plays a big role in things like the Archon quests, though obviously I'm not talking about the Archon quests in this video. This is where you can start to see a lot of these tensions between these two peoples and cultures really start to collide. Perhaps someday I'll do a video that dives more deeply into these cultural divides between the two societies, but for now, let's focus back on the history side of things. After King Deshret's death, as previously stated, there were no more gods in Sumeru, or at least in Sumeru's desert. The 7 ministers of King Deshret were either locked up inside Aru or dead. And after Rukkhadevata showed up to attempt to stop the flood of forbidden knowledge, the 7 pillars that were built by the humans under her guidance were meant to safeguard the people as much as possible against the forbidden knowledge, again, that King Deshret unleashed upon the world. Now, as I previously mentioned, the history of the desert people of Sumeru is quite politically complicated, and a lot more happens over the next 1500 years than I really have time for in this video, because looking at the timestamp, holy fuck, I need to be a bit more concise. If you guys are interested in a full breakdown of all of the political intrigue, because honestly, like genuinely, it's really, really interesting to read, let me know in the comments, because I can make it its own video, and I can also talk about the Epic of Gurabad there. But TLDR, over the course of 1500 years, there were essentially city-states that were run by kings that rose and fell, usually through the scheming of distant family members and or people who descended from the Jinn. During this time, there would be heroes who would rise rebellions to try to correct what they saw as corruption, only for the cycle to begin anew as they would take over the title of king and become corrupt themselves. Many of these heroes would end up dying, either through assassination attempts by their lovers or families, through rebellions, or in duels. By the start of the Cataclysm, the people of the desert more or less had abandoned larger cities, with the exception being the village of Aru, and they would become a nomadic tribe sort of situation where they established smaller villages for their people. Eventually, the people of the desert would become known as the Eremites by the people from the academia, but it's important to note that many within the desert identify more closely with their own tribes or mercenary groups. Additionally, during this period, Tote the Ibis King would end up asking 2 historical figures for the answers of 2 of the 3 questions that King Deshret would pose as locks to his, Sobek's, and Goatee's imprisonment. He would give the figures the gift to deceive and the gift to be loved respectively, which would lead to their downfalls and deaths, because again, we're in the desert and it's 1500 years of turmoil. On the academia side, the only other thing that's important to note before the start of the Cataclysm is Rosalind, who would later become the Harbinger Signora, joined the academia as a student. Now we come to the Cataclysm. As we all know, 500 years ago the Cataclysm started. This was the fall of Khaenri'ah and the invasion of the Abyss into most of the nations of Teyvat, causing widespread devastation and death. Unlike the other Archons who were called to Khaenri'ah by the Heavenly Principles, Rukkhadevata was tasked with protecting Irminsul from the flood of forbidden knowledge, otherwise known as abyssal corruption, which, if allowed to flourish, would leak into Teyvat's ley lines and potentially destroy untold amounts of data, history, and perhaps Teyvat as a whole. Rukkhadevata realized that she herself is contaminated by abyssal corruption, and seeing as she cannot simply erase herself to purify Irminsul, for reasons that I still don't completely understand, but Hoyo apparently does, she created Lesser Lord Kusanali to be her reincarnation, locking away both herself and as much of the corruption as she possibly could. Eventually, in the present time, Kusanali, or Nahida as she's also known, would purify both Irminsul and Rukkhadevata, which effectively erases her presence from the record of the world, which means in the present day, everyone, including Kusanali, believes that she has always been the Dendro Archon. Elsewhere in Sumeru, the Lord of the Forest dies protecting Dharma Forest, and his successors are the Rishbalin Tigers. There is also someone known as the Huntress, who finds the blind younger brother of the Bloodstained Knight in Dharma Forest, where he dies at the hands of abyssal monsters. She fulfills his dying wish, fighting against the abyssal monsters herself. However, she is eventually contaminated, and when the Bloodstained Knight shows up and finds her, he has to kill her because she has become a monster herself. Now, we move into the Girdles of the Sand, or the Gates of Everlasting Morning, which was the epicenter of sorts for the abyssal invasion into the overworld of Teyvat. It was also a place where some of the Archons at least gathered to fight against the invasion of the Abyss, as the former Hydro Archon Egeria falls in battle here, and her body becomes the Emerta, which concentrates in the oasis within the desert. However, because Egeria cannot be reborn because she's been tainted by abyssal corruption, the Dendro Archon grants her consciousness and anchor within the world. The great bird friend that has previously been asleep woke up and decided to drink the Emerta, which also held the Hydro Archon's consciousness, purifying the corruption and sacrificing herself in the process. Her form then becomes Motes of Caravana, which eventually will become the Pari, who dedicate themselves to cleansing corruption. Eventually, some of the survivors of Khaenri'ah would end up coming above ground and join the fight against the Abyss, using their technology to help as many as they can. They earn the title the Heroes of Dari for their aid. One of these heroes might have been Dainsleif, as later on Servan, the first of the Paris, finds a weakened Dainsleif and brings him to the Varroksha Oasis to recover, and forms a Laupa connection with him as the two fight alongside each other for some time against the Abyss. Eventually, the rift at the Girdle of the Sand is sealed. It's also known as Tunigi Hollow, but I'm not going to call it that because it's harder for me to pronounce. But a sign of the Aposha appears in the sky above it, indicating that the corruption is still leaking out. The Pari work alongside Nagarjuna and his Darshan to perform a cleansing rite, and Servan personally uses the Karvana to repair the seal, purifying it and extinguishing the large sign of the Aposha. Later on, Servan fuses the strongest Karvana into the Great Five Songs of Karvana, which she uses to cleanse the land of all corruption. Afterwards, however, 4 of the great songs are scattered, and Servan hides the 5th in the Varroksha Oasis, and afterwards the Oasis continues to birth new Paris. Eventually, some members of the Darshan choose to remain in the Girdles of the Sand to take on the responsibility for maintaining the seal. They also form Laupa connections with new Paris and call themselves the Order of Skeptics. After this, at some point, Dainsleif leaves the Oasis alongside the Abyss's Traveler, the Abyss sibling, I guess is what I was trying to say there. I was going to say the Abyss Traveler sibling, and that that would mean our character, but you guys know what I mean. Now, post-Cataclysm, things are a little bit complicated. Lesser Lord Kusanali is found, but given that she's just recently been born, she does not have any of the memories of Greater Lord Rukkhadevata and also lacks an experience in power. She is taken in by the Academia, but essentially locked away in the Sanctuary of Surastana, where she is kept isolated, and essentially the worship of Greater Lord Rukkhadevata is continued, while Kusanali is left neglected. About 100 years after the Cataclysm, Zandik attends the Academia, where he is referred to as a heretic and is recruited by Piero, becoming a Harbinger. Around the same time, the Temple of Silence, which originally hailed from the desert but at some point moved into the rainforest, which was responsible for collecting and preserving all of the knowledge from the era of King Deshret, departs from the rainforest due to the corruption of the sages, returning to the desert and settling into a large underground temple. The academia, seeking to cover up their departure, creates a front organization which is responsible for the custody and disposal of information and documents not fit for public dissemination. Already, we can see the corruption of the academia more clearly. Finally, sometime after the establishment of the Order of the Skeptics, an investigation team is sent from the Sumeru Academia to explore the ruins. The Order of Skeptics warns them against entering the ruins. But y'all know how that song and dance goes. The Order, attempting to protect the group, sends in one of their own, named Kilsigor, to protect them. However, while within the ruins, Kilsigor falls to the allure of the Abyss and becomes an Abyss Herald, likely killing or corrupting the investigation team in the process. Afterwards, Abyssal forces attack the Ruksha Oasis to attempt to gain the songs of the Kavrena, but the Paris and the human warriors end up fending them off. As a precautionary measure, Sirvanas seals off the Oasis and the Darin ruins in the area. However, the Order of Skeptics never really recover from this incident, losing all of their archives and, documents and history. So, with all of that slowly fading from memory, the ancient rites fall into neglect, and they neglect their duty to maintain the seal. Now, we finally get to move into the recent past, and this is where a lot of the setup for what happens in the present day of the game happens, but because this section usually deals with specific NPCs or playable characters in the game, I'm gonna skip over most of that because I don't think it really has any bearing right now. You can play through those stories in the game if you want. Instead, the important thing to note around this time is that the 6 sages have continued to consolidate power, and the treatment of those in the desert continues to worsen. Corruption runs rampant within the upper echelons of the academia, which leads them down the path we see in the Archon quest. This is also the point where the sages start looking down upon any art-related fields in Sumeru, causing a marginalization of artistic pursuits and people who want to pursue those things within Sumeru City, or really any academia-controlled locations. And with all of that, we are here at the end. You guys made it to the end with me, and honestly, that's pretty insane. These types of videos take a lot of time, energy, and me slamming my head into a wall to make, so if you guys liked this, please like, comment, and share this video with a friend so that I don't feel like I'm screaming into the void. Also, if you really like my content, consider subscribing to keep up to date with it, or becoming a channel member for extra perks. It's a good way to support me so that I can continue to make content like this. I stream Genshin Impact and Honkai Star Rail on this channel as well, and I have a whole playlist of all of my previous streams. If you have any other video games you'd like to see me do a lore deep dive on, or a timeline established, let me know in the comments. And with all of that being said, I'll see y'all in the next one, and as always, may the wind bless your travels.